In June 1960, the Congo became independent from Belgium. It was one of the largest and richest countries in Africa, sitting on vast deposits of copper, cobalt, and uranium. But within days of independence, it was already falling apart. And over the next 5 years, it would become the site of one of the most brutal proxy wars of the entire Cold War, drawing in the CIA, the Soviet Union, Belgian paratroopers, British and French mercenaries, and even Che Guevara himself. Part of the problem was that Belgium had barely prepared the country for this moment at all. In 80 years of colonial rule, Belgium had invested almost nothing in Congolese education or leadership. At independence, the entire country had somewhere around 16 university graduates out of a population of more than 14 million. The army, the force publique, had thousands of Congolese soldiers, but not a single one above the rank of sergeant. Every officer was still Belgian. The trouble started almost immediately. Congo's new prime minister was Patrice Lumumba, a fiery nationalist who had spent years in Belgian prisons for his politics. Its president was Joseph Kasavubu. Neither man controlled the army, and just 5 days after independence, that same underpaid, unpromoted army mutinied against its remaining Belgian officers. Violence spread through the cities, white settlers fled, and Belgium, unwilling to simply let go of its former colony, sent paratroopers back in, officially to protect its citizens. It's in this chaos that Congo's wealthiest province made its move. On July 11, 1960, Katanga declared independence under a politician named Moise Tshombe. Katanga held most of the country's mining wealth, and its secession was bankrolled almost immediately by Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, the giant Belgian mining company that controlled the region's copper and cobalt. Within days of the declaration, Union Minière transferred the equivalent of $35 million straight into Tshombe's accounts, money that should have gone to Lumumba's national treasury as tax revenue, and used it instead to fund Katanga's own army. Not long after, another mineral-rich region, South Kasai, also broke away under Albert Kalonji, a former ally of Lumumba's. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations to help him restore order, but when the UN refused to help him crush the secessions by force, he did something that terrified Washington. He turned to the Soviet Union for weapons and transport planes. To the Americans, still just over a decade into the Cold War, and having just watched China fall to communism, this was a nightmare scenario. A newly independent, resource-rich African nation tilting toward Moscow. CIA Station Chief Larry Devlin cabled home that the Congo was experiencing a classic communist effort to take over the government. The political system, meanwhile, had already broken down entirely. On September 5, 1960, President Kasavubu announced he was dismissing Lumumba as prime minister. Lumumba responded on national radio by announcing that he was dismissing Kasavubu right back. Neither man actually had the constitutional authority to fire the other, and for several surreal days, Congo had two rival governments, each claiming to be the legitimate one, each broadcasting appeals to the public and to foreign embassies. It was exactly the kind of paralysis Mobutu needed as cover. President Eisenhower's response was blunt. According to CIA officials, he personally authorized Lumumba's assassination. CIA Director Allen Dulles reportedly ordered a poison specifically designed to be slipped into Lumumba's toothpaste. That plan never worked, but it barely mattered. In September 1960, Congo's Army Chief of Staff, a young colonel named Joseph Mobutu, staged a coup, pushed Lumumba aside, and placed him under house arrest. Lumumba tried to flee to his supporters in the east, but he was captured. And in January 1961, in one of the most notorious acts of the entire Cold War in Africa, he was flown to Katanga and handed directly over to Tshombe's secessionists. He was beaten, then executed by firing squad. His body was later dissolved in acid to make sure there would be no grave, no martyr's shrine. A Belgian parliamentary inquiry decades later concluded that Belgium bore moral responsibility for his death. and it's now widely accepted that Belgian and American intelligence services worked in parallel to make sure Lumumba never returned to power. With Lumumba gone, the United Nations peacekeeping force in the Congo, known as ONUC, took a more aggressive role trying to end the Katangan secession outright. In August 1961, it launched Operation Rum Punch, disarming and arresting dozens of the foreign mercenaries and officers propping up Chombe's gendarmes. Weeks later, it went even further with Operation Morthaw, no longer just removing foreign fighters but attempting to end the secession by force outright. Fighting broke out between UN troops and Katangese forces in the provincial capital, and it's in the middle of this escalating UN combat mission that the organization lost its own leader. In September 1961, UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld flew to Ndola, just across the border, to personally negotiate a ceasefire with Chombe. His plane crashed on approach, killing everyone aboard. Investigators have never been able to fully rule out sabotage, and to this day, the UN keeps the case technically open. What's certain is that powerful mining and political interests had every reason not to want Hammarskjöld to succeed. Despite losing its Secretary-General, the UN mission pressed on, and by early 1963, with the help of Indian and Swedish jet fighters bombing Katangese positions, Chombe's secession collapsed. South Kasai fell not long after. For a moment, it looked like Congo might actually hold together as one country. That moment didn't last. In 1964, a new uprising exploded out of the eastern provinces. Its fighters called themselves the Simbas, meaning lions in Swahili, and they were led by men who saw themselves as carrying on Lumumba's revolution. Within months, the Simbas had swept across roughly half the country, seizing the city of Stanleyville and declaring it the capital of a People's Republic of the Congo. Once again, the Cold War's two sides picked their teams. The Soviet Union and China began funneling arms and advisors to the Simbas, and Cuba went even further. Fidel Castro sent Che Guevara himself to try to build a genuine communist revolution in the heart of Africa. Meanwhile, the CIA doubled down on the man it had helped install, Mobutu, now the effective power behind President Kasavubu's government. Washington and Brussels flew in around 200 Cuban exile pilots, men who'd fled Castro's Cuba years earlier and were now, strangely, fighting on the opposite side of history from the country they'd left. Alongside them came white mercenaries recruited from South Africa, Rhodesia, Britain, and France. The most famous of these mercenary commanders was an Irish South African adventurer named Mad Mike Hoare. He led a unit called 5 Commando, a few hundred foreign fighters who'd later be nicknamed the Wild Geese, and a smaller rival mercenary unit, 6 Commando, operated alongside them. By late 1964, together with the Congolese army, they were pushing back hard against the Simbas, who by this point were already carrying out mass public executions of teachers, clerks, civil servants, and anyone else branded a counter-revolutionary or a westernized intellectual in the territory they controlled. Historians estimate at least 10,000 to 20,000 Congolese civilians were killed under Simba rule. The breaking point came at Stanleyville. The Simbas were holding hundreds of Western hostages, mostly Belgian and American civilians, and as government forces closed in, on November 24, 1964, Belgium and the United States launched a joint airborne assault, Operation Dragon Rouge, dropping Belgian paratroopers directly onto the airfield, while Hoare's mercenaries rushed the city by land. They arrived just hours too late. The Simbas had already begun massacring the hostages, killing at least 27 of them before the rescue force could reach them. It became one of the most harrowing Cold War flashpoints most people have never heard of. By the time Che Guevara actually arrived in the Congo, in April 1965, the rebellion he'd come to save was already crumbling. He crossed into the eastern Congo secretly with about a dozen Cuban fighters, hoping to train and inspire a genuine Marxist guerrilla movement that could spread across the continent. Instead, he found chaos. rival Congolese factions who barely trusted each other, fighters he considered undisciplined and unmotivated, and a level of superstition around magic and bulletproofing rituals that left him baffled. He didn't speak Swahili, many of his own men didn't speak Spanish. After 7 frustrating months, with the mercenaries and Cuban exile pilots closing in, Guevara and his remaining men were secretly evacuated back across Lake Tanganyika. He opened his own diary of the mission with a single blunt sentence: "This is the history of a failure." While Guevara's revolution was unraveling in the East, the man the CIA had backed from the very beginning was consolidating everything. In November 1965, Joseph Mobutu carried out his second coup, this time pushing aside President Kasavubu for good and declaring himself head of state. Washington was thrilled. Here was a Congolese leader who had helped bring down Lumumba, fought off a Soviet and Cuban-backed rebellion, and was firmly, reliably anti-communist. For the next 3 decades, the United States would treat Mobutu as one of its most important allies in Africa, funding him and arming him almost without question, no matter what he did at home. And what he did at home was staggering. Mobutu renamed the country Zaire, renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko, and built one of the most extreme personality cults and one of the most corrupt governments in modern history, right down to the leopard skin hat he wore to every public appearance as a symbol of his authority. He's believed to have looted billions of dollars in state wealth into personal fortunes, palaces and property across Europe, while ordinary Congolese lived amid collapsing infrastructure that Belgium had left behind and Mobutu never bothered to rebuild. Because he was useful to Washington as a Cold War partner, almost none of it mattered to his foreign backers. Successive American presidents received him at the White House, and US aid kept flowing for over 30 years. That single trade, stability, and anti-communism, in exchange for looking away from a dictatorship, would define the entire second half of the Cold War in Africa. The human cost of the Congo Crisis itself, from independence in 1960 through Mobutu's final coup in 1965, is estimated at around 100,000 lives, an assassinated prime minister, a dead UN Secretary General, and a country whose institutions never really recovered. But the Congo wasn't unique. It was really just the opening act. Over the following 2 decades, this exact same pattern, a resource-rich African nation gaining independence, splitting along Cold War lines, and getting flooded with foreign money, weapons, and mercenaries, would repeat itself again and again. In Angola, Cuban troops and Soviet weapons would back one side of a civil war, while apartheid South Africa and the CIA backed another. In Mozambique, a similar Cold War proxy war would tear the country apart for over a decade. Rhodesia's white minority government would fight its own Cold War-flavored bush war before becoming Zimbabwe. And Mobutu's Zaire itself, propped up for so long by American money, would eventually collapse into the First and Second Congo Wars of the 1990s, conflicts so large they'd later be called Africa's World War. None of that happens in a vacuum, and none of it happens without what took place in the Congo in the early 1960s. It's the moment the Cold War truly arrived in Africa, and it's the template, foreign intervention justified by ideology, resource wealth as the real prize underneath, and local leaders propped up or torn down depending on which side of the Iron Curtain they were useful to for almost everything that followed. That's the story of the Congo Crisis. If you want to see how this same Cold War pattern played out just a few years later in Angola, with Cuban troops, apartheid South Africa, and the CIA all fighting over the same stretch of coastline, let me know in the comments and I'll cover it next.